Hi guys, welcome to this final lecture on the poverty unit for the stratification topic for the GCSE Sociology spec, which we use Welsh Board Eduqas. And this lecture is looking at the impact of globalisation on poverty. So what I'd like to think about is the fact that globalisation, because of globalisation, parts of the world are much closer together. And what I'd like you to do is just bullet point your ideas of, well, what do you think globalisation actually is? Okay, what do you think globalisation actually is and what different aspects are included in it? So I've got a kind of brief-ish definition here, and I'll give you the full definition in a second. So globalisation is an increase in the exchange and movement of ideas, technology, products and services. National boundaries are less important, and most importantly, trade moves freely. So really think about what sorts of things have driven the increased movement of ideas, for example. What technology? Try and add that to your notes. If national boundaries are less important, what kind of institutions have become more important than the nation state? And what has allowed trade to move much more freely? Okay, add that to your notes, what you think globalisation might be. Okay. So here is your official, if you like, definition for globalisation for the exam. It's the process of different parts of the world being brought closer together by the exchange of goods. So that's to do with trade, predominantly things like shipping, aeroplane, all sorts. The movement of people, which has been driven by the improvement in aeroplane technology, travel technology, which has actually become much cheaper. Services, and particularly communication, made possible by new technology. Now, communication and services, a lot of those things we now consume via the internet. So, for example, whether it's apps on our phone or watching Netflix, those are all things that have allowed the exchange of services, communication and ideas through things like technology, mainly the internet. So what we have now in globalisation are things called multinational companies or multinational corporations. And these are extremely powerful in a globalised world, to the extent that individual governments might not be able to control their activities. Because those companies might be worth so much to that economy, they might just let them get away with whatever they're up to in order to keep them there for their tax and employment. So if these companies move their headquarters, okay, which would be like, their financial headquarters from one country to another, or maybe even their factories, they move them from one country to another, that would make them a multinational corporation. So I'd like to have a think, why might a company do that? Why might a company move their headquarters, for example, to somewhere like Luxembourg or Ireland? Why might a company move their headquarters to one of those two countries? Or factories. Like where might a company move their factory production to? And why might they do that? So a lot of factories have disappeared from the UK, but where have they all gone and why have they done that? See if you can think of any ideas and add them down. And then the other one I'm thinking about is what's the effect of all these companies moving their business abroad? Like, what impact is that having on economies like the UK and people within the UK, particularly those who are closer to poverty? So hopefully you've had a go at writing down some of your ideas. So why might a company move their headquarters or factories? Well, they might do it for easier access to technology or for lower wages, lower labour. Okay, so we know that lots of factories have been moved to the developing world, whether that's, Taiwan, India, some Latin American countries, because it's much cheaper, okay, labour's much cheaper there, okay? And the effect of companies moving their businesses abroad, one thing to mention, a company might move their headquarters to a different country because corporation tax will be lower, which is perfectly legal for them to do. So they can be based in Ireland, for example. Luxembourg are two of our closer, lower corporation tax havens, if you like. And that means the company doesn't have to pay as much tax to our government, bearing in mind they still sell all their products to us as a population. But ultimately, the effect of these companies moving their business abroad, particularly the factory production, is that it can cause significant unemployment and poverty for those left behind. For example, in Wales at the moment, Tata Steel is being closed down. That is the final steel production factory in the UK, and it's going to probably lead to the loss of about 3,000 jobs, I think, in that area. And there are no other jobs for those people. There are no other jobs in that area for those people. There are no other jobs like that in the UK anymore. So that is going to cause significant unemployment and poverty for those left behind and for those families. Another example to think about, apart from Tata Steel in Wales, is what happened with P&O ferries in 2019. So hopefully you've got this case study written in front of you. You can make notes on it if you want. So they moved the registration of its ferries. Okay, you can see a picture of a ferry there. They control lots of the crossings from the UK and France, but they also have a lot of cruises that go from, I don't know, Portsmouth and other ports around the world. So they moved their registration of their ferries to Cyprus from the UK. So that meant that each ferry, each ship, if you like, was registered as being part of Cyprus. Okay, and therefore had to adhere to Cyprus laws, not UK laws. So let me go through some of the details. So it said here, for operational and accounting reasons, we have concluded that the best course of action is to register all ships to be under the Cyprus flag. Now, the bit in brackets is me. This means that what happens on the boats is now under Cyprus law, not UK law. The spokesman said Cyprus was among the world's leading flag registries, resulting in fewer inspections and delays. Well, why might we want to be a little bit concerned that these ships are not being inspected? Okay, why would this be something of a concern from maybe a health and safety point of view? That's me in the brackets. He added, the move will result in significantly more favourable tonnage tax arrangements as these ships will be flagged in an EU member state, which of course Cyprus still is, as being part of Greece. So in 2022, that was 2019, and then in 2022, P&O then sacked nearly 800 of their UK staff, okay, with hardly any notice. And all of those staff were then replaced with agency workers from the UK. So like recruitment agencies were called up and said, we need this many staff to work on our ships, and they had to provide them. Well, they could provide them. The problem was that these agency workers were paid much less than the UK minimum wage because they were registered in Cyprus. In theory, these workers weren't working in the UK, in a UK business. They were working for a Cypriot business. And that allowed them to pay much lower wages. I think the headline there on the right-hand side says £5.50 an hour. That was actually higher than some. P&O Ferries Chief Executive Officer Peter Hebblethwaite was really criticised at the Transport Committee, which is the government committee, and he admitted that staff paid an average of just £5.50 had been brought in to cover routes. So 800 staff had been sacked, and they'd been on proper salaried positions. They got sacked and replaced by these agency workers. Now, Mr. Hebblethwaite is paid a basic salary of $325,000 a year, and he also gets a bonus. And he admitted that the seafarers now receive an hourly wage of £5.50 an hour, with the lowest being £5.15. The UK minimum wage would be £9.50. So these workers are being paid almost 50% less for their work than a UK worker, even though P&O is operating in UK waters, on UK ports, is transporting UK passengers. People who work on them are not being paid the same as someone who would be employed within a UK business. So I would like you guys to answer some of questions on this particular case study. The first question was, and this should all be on the worksheet that I will have given you, but in case you haven't got the worksheet, here's the first question. What minimum wage was P&O paying its new workers? How does this compare to the UK minimum wage law? So that's your first question. Second question, why was P&O able to pay a lower wage to the UK workers? They're still UK workers, but why was P&O able to pay them a lower wage once they'd replaced them with these agency staff? Now, the third question is why are less inspections something to be a bit concerned about? And when they say they're looking for a more favourable tonnage tax arrangement, why should we also be concerned about the new tax arrangement that they're looking for under Cyprus? What does that suggest P&O are up to? And I guess the final two questions are about globalisation. First one, how was it that globalisation has allowed P&O to pay workers much less? How has globalisation enabled P&O to exploit UK workers? And finally, the last question, which is question number 5, what impact then has globalisation had on poverty in the UK using this case study? Has globalisation made poverty worse because of what P&O ferries did? Or has globalisation made poverty better? If you could answer that would be great in your notes. The next case study I want you to have a look at is about clothes manufacturing in Turkey. And this is about clothing manufacturing, quite often in the news because of some of the problems within the factories in which they're produced. So when companies outsource in manufacturing of their goods to other countries, this can lead to exploitation and poverty in these other countries. Now, what I'd like you to do is, it's going to be a bit annoying, I need you to pause this lecture and look up Undercover, the refugees who make our clothes, Panorama, BBC News. Find that on YouTube. It's 2 minutes, 40 seconds long. I want you to summarise what is happening in Turkey. How are the clothes being made? What are the wages? Where are the customers? They're not in Turkey. I'd also like you to answer, apart from low wages, how else are the workers being exploited? Consider their age. And then, how has globalisation made the poverty of refugees in Turkey worse? And how does this news report show the benefits of globalisation? Okay, the fact that there is a news report on this case shows something about the benefit of globalisation, of communication. Like, how would we be able to know about this if it wasn't for globalisation? So that's your second case study to look at when it comes to the impact of globalisation on poverty. But this is globally, not looking at what's happening in the UK. The other things to think about when it comes to the impact of globalisation is actually, has it increased a sense of relative poverty in the UK? Like having all these images beamed to us of luxurious lifestyles, of holidays, of goods and designer goods particularly, have they made us sort of feel a stronger sense of relative poverty? If not you, but maybe somebody who lives in a working class or poverty background. So just to remind you, there's your definition of relative poverty, where your basic needs are met, but you go without things that are expected for people living in that society. This changes over time. So see if you can make a few notes of any examples of how we might have a stronger sense of relative poverty because of some of the products and the things that we can see or as open to us as a possibility because of globalisation. If you can do that on your notes, that would be great. Or do you think that globalisation has actually made life better? And has it made it easier because of the number of the products available we can get? And actually the cost of products, have they gone down? Some products have definitely gone down because of globalisation. Boring example, but I know, for example, clothing, we've just been talking about. Clothing is much cheaper now because a lot of it is made in foreign countries with lower wages. And we don't have to pay so much for our clothing. So has that made life better? Annotate as many examples you can think of it. Globalisation may be raising our expectations, making it more difficult for relative poverty, or has globalisation actually made life better for us all because we've got access to all these different goods and products? So the final thing I want to go through with you is the functionalist and Marxist view of globalisation and poverty. So functionalists believe that globalisation is great. It creates jobs and it fuels the economy. They are super positive. There are more companies, there are more branches opening all over the world, and as a result, this means more jobs for both the economies here, but also abroad. And actually, they point out that globalisation has lifted poorer countries out of poverty. They have opened factories in these countries that have employed people that otherwise wouldn't have had well-paid jobs. And ultimately, these global companies, they are accountable to a global media now, which means they can't get away with terrible practices because it will show up in the news. Perhaps not as often as functionalists believe, but that there is an element of truth to that. Like I said, that Turkey report from Panorama, that only exists because of the global media, okay? And the companies that were selling those clothes, like M&S and ASOS, they have since turned around to their supplier there and said, no, this is unacceptable, do not do this, this can't be happening. So that is a positive. Marxists, unsurprisingly, have a negative view of globalisation and poverty. They point out that this global ruling class, they run multinational companies and they earn huge amounts of money, huge amount of profit. And they pay poor people in the poor countries as little as possible to try and maximise that profit margin. As well as that, they also minimise costs by cutting health and safety regulations. And this really harms workers. You know, they might not they might not give them safety gear to wear, they might not have protective gloves, protective goggles. And this can lead to them increasing their profits, but that can really harm the workers. And finally, they point out that these companies, they cause significant pollution and they don't clean up after themselves. And Marx is really critical of how these corporations are harming the planet. And they would also point out, and you can use some of your stuff from Crime and Deviance here, that there are significantly more opportunities for corporate crime. You might think about the case of Starbucks and their dodgy accounting, meaning that they were claiming that they weren't making any profit in the UK, so they paid no corporation tax. And you can also write about, perhaps the fact that Marks and Spencer's and ASOS, they have been selling clothes, if you like, that have been made and produced by children in some of these cases that was identified in Panorama, which is an example of a corporate crime, even though they have, and quite legitimately, denied any knowledge of this happening. So, thank you for listening to this final lecture on poverty. I've given you an exam question to have a look at on this slide. Okay, so have a go at doing it. Remember, it's a 9-marker, and this is Welsh spec, Eduqas. You need to discuss the view that the poor are to blame for their poverty. And you need to discuss at least 2 views of poverty in society. So try and think of one that says, yes, the poor are to blame for their poverty. Try and think of the arguments I've talked about in previous lectures. And then I'd like you to have another one challenging it, saying, no, the poor are not to blame for their poverty. And then you need a conclusion with a judgment. Okay? Have a go at this. On the next slide, I've got the mark scheme, but please pause it at this point, have a go at the essay, and then have a look at the mark scheme and then mark it and improve it. So pause it now, have a go. And then I'm going to flick over to the mark scheme now. Okay, thanks so much for listening.